started. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. My name is Rachel Litt, and I am the Associate Director of School and Teacher Programs here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to today's professional development program, which is the concluding event of our series, Teaching the Holocaust Through Film. Today's session will focus on using recorded survivor testimony in classrooms. In the other sessions of the series, we heard from experts about the impact that feature films and documentaries can have in the classroom. And in today's sessions, we'll hear about a different form of film to use in the classroom, which is recorded Holocaust survivor testimony. The museum has developed two recorded testimony resources that are free for public use, our Survivor Stories exhibition and the Heritage Testimonies program. Survivor Stories is a virtual exhibition that is available both at the museum and online that allows visitors to ask questions to a panel of 10 survivors from our Speakers Bureau. Heritage Testimonies are recordings of second and third generation survivors telling their families' stories of survival through the Holocaust. There are other resources available for hearing survivor testimony as well, which I'm sure Professor Patt will mention in his presentation. We consistently hear from students that listening to survivor testimony is one of the most impactful forms of Holocaust education. But as the survivor population ages and we approach a time when there will be no more survivors, how do we work with recorded testimony to give students the experience of hearing a firsthand account of the Holocaust? What is the student experience like engaging with recorded survivor testimony? We hope this program will help answer these and other questions you may have and give you tools for your pedagogical toolbox. We're looking forward to a meaningful and productive program today. In order to maximize our experience together, we ask the following. First, please stay with us for the whole program if possible. This will also help maximize the number of CTLE hours that you can earn. Second, please take notes. Third, after the program today, we'll be sending out an evaluation form and a CTLE application form. Please take a few minutes to complete these. Your feedback is very, very important to us and helps us to develop more and better programs for you. And if you wish to receive CTLE credit, please make sure that your screen name matches the name that you use to register for this program and that you will be using to apply for credit. I'd like to make a couple special shout outs, first to Paul Rudensky and second to Leah Sean for their help in bringing this program to fruition. Our program today is part of the Fania Gottsfeld Heller and Joseph Heller Professional Development Series and is made possible through the generous sponsorship of Dr. Jacqueline Heller, a member of her parents, Fania Gottsfeld Heller and Joseph Heller. This is also possible through the generosity of the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. This program is also co-sponsored by the New York University Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. Our program today will be led by Professor Avinoam Patt, who is the Maurice Greenberg Professor of Holocaust Studies at New York University. Dr. Patt previously held the Doris and Simon Konover Chair of Judaic Studies at the University of Connecticut, where he served as director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life. From 2007 to 2019, he was the Philip D. Feltman Professor of Modern Jewish History at the University of Hartford, where he served as director of the Museum of Jewish Civilization. He also worked previously as the Miles Lerman Applied Research Scholar for Jewish Life and Culture at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dr. Patt's newest book, Israel and the Holocaust, was published by Bloomsbury Press as part of the Perspectives on the Holocaust series in 2024. This is just one of our many professional development programs for educators, and we hope that you'll join us for other programs as well. Our next program, The Power of Storytelling to Teach the Holocaust, will be on May 14th. This program will feature international best-selling author Jack Fairweather, who will talk about his methods for using storytelling and biographies to teach the Holocaust. We also have an upcoming program on June 6th, which will be a talk by Dr. Diane Affumato of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum about the Evian Conference and the refugee crisis of the late 1930s. Stay tuned for more offerings also throughout the summer and during the fall. For more information and to register for any of these events, please check your email for our e-blast newsletter featuring our professional development programs, or you can go to our museum website, mjhnyc.org, and click events. Again, just one last reminder to please make sure your screen name matches your personal name so that we have an accurate record of our attendance. And without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Dr. Patt.
Okay, thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to everyone for taking time out of your Sunday afternoon to join this program. So what I'd like to do is share with you, and in a moment I'm going to share my screen so you can see my PowerPoint, share with you some resources on how to use audiovisual testimony, survivor testimony, in the classroom, but also provide some background history on sort of the genealogy of testimony, where these testimonies come from, try to explain sort of the urge to record testimony, and also the history of all these collection projects, so we can think about sort of how we use different sources, what resources are available, what's going to work best with our students in the classroom. And then think specifically with a number of examples that I will share of ways to use specific types of testimony to teach specific lessons in the classroom. So let me just share my screen. Okay, there we go. Um, so what you can see here is also just a few different examples of types of survivor testimony that I'm going to be talking about today. And we'll go through different resources from places like the Fortune Video Archive to the USC Shoah Foundation, um, collections, to also looking at some of the history of the recording of testimony. As you can see, this screenshot from Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, and sort of think about where this urge to record testimony comes from. Um, so one of the first things that I want us to think about is both sort of the idea of where testimony comes from, but also the challenges of transferring memory from one generation to the next, and how we wrestle with the challenges of transferring that memory from one generation to the next, and then sort of the choice of what we remember. And both I'm thinking in terms of the two layers of how memory works, both the memories that are shared by the survivors and also the memories that is part of the learning that our students engage in, what they take away from them, from those video testimonies that they watch. And of course, so the challenges of memory is sort of thinking about what we remember, why we remember, how we remember, right? So these tools of memory that assist in this process of memory and of learning and of the transfer of the experiences of one person to another. But of course, the ultimate challenge here is this question that I put at the bottom of, can we remember? And this is both sort of a moral imperative, this question of the importance of why it's important to remember, but thinking for our students, why it's important for us to learn about these things, why it's important for us to learn about the Holocaust, why it's important for us to learn from the experiences of others. But can we actually remember something that was experienced by another person, and acknowledging the challenges of transferring memory from one person to another, what we take away, and sort of what each person brings to that experience as they learn from another. Um, if we think about this imperative to remember, we can think about the centrality of the survivor as sort of that bearer of memory, the obligation that survivors carry to both the dead and the living. This imperative to remember, which you can see here, Elie Wiesel at the dedication of the Holocaust Museum in 1993, so over 30 years ago, talking about the obligation to the dead and to the living, an obligation both to those who died, to share both their stories and the stories of the survivors' experiences. So, an obligation to the past, and also an obligation to the present, the living, and an obligation to the future, those who are not alive yet. But even when Wiesel received his Nobel Prize in 1986, he talked about the challenges of memory, this idea that forgetting, as he said, was never an option, that remembering is a noble and necessary act, that the verb zachor in the Hebrew Bible, to remember, is central. As he says, no commandment figures so frequently, so insistently in the Bible. It is incumbent upon us to remember the good we have received and the evil that we have suffered. And so he wrestles with this obligation of memory, the obligation to remember, both for those who died, but for those who are to share their stories. But also, as he says here in the fifth paragraph down, We tried, it was not easy at first because of the language. Language failed us. We would have to invent a new vocabulary, for our own words were inadequate, anemic. And then, too, the people around us refused to listen. And even those who listened refused to believe. And even those who believed could not comprehend. Of course, they could not. Nobody could. The experience of the camps defies comprehension. And I share this with you, this question of how does one wrestle with the limits of language? The idea that language fails us, the idea that it is impossible, even if you have this imperative to remember, it is impossible to translate the experiences that one experienced during the war, both because there are no words that exist in language to capture the enormity, the terror of what one experienced. This is sort of a response to one's traumatic experience that you can't share it in words. And you can't share it in words that your audience will understand, that your audience will listen to, that your audience will be able to comprehend. And so I want us to think about this because as we think about the testimonies that we are listening to, we have to wrestle with the fact that even as the survivor has the urge, the obligation to share their testimony, to remember, to even if there is sort of perhaps a natural inclination to try to forget, but as Wiesel says, forgetting is not an option. So the imperative to remember that is there, but then how do you translate those memories in a language that is comprehensible for somebody who is not there? Wiesel says it is not possible, and yet there is an obligation to remember. Um, this is a picture which you can see here of Elie Wiesel very soon after liberation. And I share this with you because one of the things that's even interesting if we think about sort of the process of testimony. So we're all familiar with Wiesel's Night. It's used very commonly as a testimony in teaching, very often taught in a language arts class. But what people are often not aware of is that Wiesel wrote his original memoir, which you can see here a copy of, the Yiddish cover page of the memoir, which was published very soon after the war. This is part of a series that was published in Buenos Aires called Das Polnische Judentum. And his original title was Und die Welt hat geschwiegen. And it's a much longer text than the translation first into French and then into English of Night. It's a much longer text, and the Yiddish title is called And the World Was Silent. And what's interesting for us to think about is not only how does one translate one's memories from Yiddish to French to English, but also how in the process of thinking about who your reading audience is, the way in which translation from one language to another and thinking about who your audience is going to affect the way in which you share your testimony, in which you share your story. So Wiesel in this case goes from the Yiddish, which is much angrier, much more resentment about the silence of the world, to the French and then to the English, where Night is more about sort of conveying a universal message about both human suffering and resilience and the importance of memory, right? And so you can think about how memory changes over time, not sort of that you forget things, but the way in which you translate your memories and the significance of your memories change over time. Um, so if we think about sort of this imperative to remember, and I'm situating sort of these survivor testimonies that we're going to talk about within this longer tradition of other forms of testimony, of memoir, right? In a sense, right, the audiovisual testimony is not unlike a memoir. It's just different in that while someone may have time to write and to reflect on what they're writing, you're capturing in that moment one's recorded testimony, one's recorded sharing of their experiences. And of course, the emotion comes through differently, but perhaps sort of the motivation is similar. So I'm showing you here Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz, also written immediately after the war in 1946. And with this poem that comes in the beginning, Levi's sort of Shema prayer, in which he talks about the imperative to remember as well, and also the obligation that this memory carries with the one who the memory carries with the one who listens to it, the one who absorbs it, the one who receives it. And so Levi shares this obligation. He writes, if this is a man, right, the original title of Survival in Auschwitz, You who live in safe in your warm houses, you who find returning in the evening hot food and friendly faces, consider if this is a man who works in the mud, who does not know peace, who fights for a scrap of bread, who dies because of a yes or a no. Consider if this is a woman without hair and without name, with no more strength to remember, her eyes empty and her womb cold like a frog in winter. And then he says, right, so I want you to listen to what I'm going to share with you and think about sort of humans and dehumanization. But as you reflect on this, meditate that this came about. I commend these words to you, right? So now I, the survivor, am sharing these experiences with you, but you who are receiving them now become the carrier of this memory. And as I commend these words to you, carve them in your hearts, right? So this is a reiteration of the Shema prayer that comes from the Hebrew Bible, but it's invoked in a different way. You carry this obligation. Carve them in your hearts at home, in the street, going to bed, rising. Repeat them to your children. Or may your house fall apart. May illness impede you. May your children turn their faces from you. This is a heavy burden that one carries, this obligation of memory. And he says, I will share this with you, but now you have an obligation, right? You have to listen, you have to reflect, you have to absorb it. And then you have to carry the obligation of teaching it forward. And if you don't, he curses us, right? May your house fall apart, may illness impede you, may your children turn their faces from you. So I share this with you for us to think about the heavy obligation that is carried with both the survivor thinking about an obligation to remember the failure, the inadequacy of language to convey what one experienced. But if they take upon themselves this obligation, this burden to share, then there is a heavy obligation upon the listener, upon the receiver, with what to do with this shared knowledge, with this shared wisdom. So, in brief, I just want to situate sort of these types of survivor testimonies that we're going to talk about within a larger genealogy of testimony. And we can think about this word testimony, and I'll come back to different ways in my explanation of how this word testimony works. Testimony can mean many different things, right? Testimony, as we're using it here, can be a text that is supporting the writing of history. But testimony also in its original form is a form of religious witnessing, right? A religious bearing of testimony, of providing edut, that's the Hebrew word of a type of witnessing that takes place. And of course, we can think about testimony as it works in a judicial setting, right? One bears witness in a criminal case, right? So I want us to think about this, and this can be an interesting exercise to do with students to think about what testimony means and what it means to hear someone else's testimony, what it means to become a witness to somebody else's testimony. Um, so the testimonies that we're going to look at today, this tradition of survivor testimony, of course, has a much longer lineage. And it's important to point out that there is a lineage of collecting testimonies from before World War II, right? This idea of writing and recording for the writing of history. And here I'm showing you the portrait of Emanuel Ringelblum, the creator of the underground archive, the Oyneg Shabbos underground archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. Ringelblum, of course, was a historian and a social welfare activist and a teacher, and he created this archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. And in the process of creating this archive in the Warsaw Ghetto that would be buried underground, they also collected testimonies, right? This idea of writing down and recording the testimonies of Jews who could bear witness to their experiences from the period of the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939, in September of 1939, or share their experiences from the period of ghettoization in the Warsaw Ghetto, or share experiences from other towns outside of Warsaw, that you would collect these, record these, bury them underground, and this would provide an archive for historians for writing in the future. And of course, in the aftermath of the war, you see the historical commissions in the DP camps also continuing in this tradition of the obligation to remember, here invoked in a biblical sense, remember what Amalek did unto thee. But then you can see the hand of death pointing down, saying, collect and record. over pages of testimony, right? Writing down how have Jews throughout their history, you can say a clock throughout their history, how have Jews remembered previous historical events? They have remembered by writing it down. And so this writing and this recording that one does out of an obligation to those who have died, to those who have not survived, is also a way of making sure that these events are remembered in the future. And so what's quite interesting is if we think about it, there are testimony collection projects that began during the war. And we can think about using testimonies that are recorded during the war for the purposes of teaching this history. And there are testimonies that are collected immediately after the war, right? And so, in some sense, the projects that I'm going to talk to you about today emerge from these also wartime and post-war projects of recording testimonies to make sure that those experiences are recorded for future generations. I don't know how many people are familiar with this interview project by David Boder, but David Boder was a psychologist who traveled to the displaced persons camps in the immediate aftermath of the war. He was a multilingual polyglot. He could record interviews. He was originally from the Baltics, so he could record interviews with survivors in German and in Yiddish and in French and in English. And I'm trying to remember what other languages. I think he also has some in Russian and Polish. And so there is a collection, and what he brought with him, he was actually interested in recording these testimonies of survivors in the immediate aftermath of the war in the DP camps. I think really to study what we would call today the idea of post-traumatic stress, but to record these interviews with survivors, but also to learn about their experiences. But he brought with him a copper wire recording device. And he was a professor at the time at the Illinois Institute of Technology. And they have essentially digitized these copper wire recordings. So if you go to the website Voices of the Holocaust, you can actually hear these recordings, and there's incredible transcripts of these. You can hear these recordings that he conducted in 1946. And they've called the site Voices of the Holocaust. I'll just share with you a brief recording here.
With Abram Kimmelman at the 8 minute or so, 7.5 minutes of the school. Also, Herr Kimmelman, Wolfman, also Herr Silberman.
So I'll stop it there, but just to give you a sense of what it sounds like, and there is a transcript that also has a translation. So it can be quite interesting to just share this with students so they can hear the voices of survivors in the immediate aftermath of the war as recorded by David Boder. And actually a number of people have written about this. There's a book by Alan Rosen called The Wonder of Their Voices, where he analyzes this testimony collection project by David Boder. And of course, as I mentioned before, you can also think about sort of testimony in the lineage of survivor testimonies that are used in a criminal justice proceeding. So you can see here, for example, a testimony collected in the immediate aftermath of the war by Dina Pronicheva, a Jewish survivor of Babi Yar, the massacre near Kiev, in the ravine near Kiev, testifying about her experiences during a war crimes trial immediately after the war, right? So you can think about testimony in that regard. Or I'm showing you here, and I'll come back to this example. This is a picture. It's a little hard to see, but this is also a public testimony. So right here, standing in the middle, is Tzivia Lebedkin, who was one of the fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto. And this is a picture of her in 1946 offering her testimony again to a live audience of about, the estimate was there about 3,000 people at a kibbutz called Kibbutz Yagur. She was one of the first ghetto fighters to reach Palestine in the aftermath of the war. And so, of course, there was a great deal of interest in her testimony as she shared her story of what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. But I share this with you also because we're going to see a number of examples of subsequent testimonies by Tzivia Lebedkin telling her story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. But it's interesting to think about this idea of sort of bearing witness before this large public audience and sort of the way in which it was received in the aftermath of the war. Here's a close-up picture of her doing this in 1946. And then it's serialized and recorded and published in a number of different places, including in English and Commentary Magazine in 1947, where she describes crawling out of the Warsaw Ghetto through the sewers. Of course, if we think about sort of the genealogy of testimony, one of the central turning points is the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, after he's captured by the Mossad in Argentina in 1960. And one of the central points of the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961 is to give the survivors an opportunity to bear witness. Now, again, right, think about this bearing witness in a judicial proceeding, but also think about the power of the survivors' voices in public education in a historical example, as we see in the case of the Eichmann trial. And this is the Attorney General of Israel, Gideon Hausner, who, working together with survivor historian Rachel Auerbach, who was a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, and was actually one of only 2 remaining activists of the Oinig Shabbos Ringelblum's underground archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, she strongly encouraged Hausner to base his whole case essentially on survivor testimony. And so at the Eichmann trial, they put Adolf Eichmann on trial, and they decide that it's not just going to be a trial specifically about Eichmann, but essentially an opportunity to teach the Israeli public about the broader history of the Holocaust. And there are 108 survivors who offer their testimonies live as part of the trial. And what's quite significant in terms of sort of the historical context of this is that in Israel in 1961, there was no public television. There simply just the technology had not arrived or developed yet. But in the context of the trial, they basically create a possibility to bring in cameras and to begin recording and to begin sort of developing television in Israel. And so for this reason, we have archival recordings. These are actually all included as part of the Steven Spielberg Video Archive at Hebrew University that can easily be accessed on YouTube. And I'll show you some recordings in a moment that include the survivor testimony from the Eichmann trial. This is actually a very well-known figure in Israel, Yechiel Dinur, the novelist whose pen name was Katzetnik, who in this moment is testifying about what he called Planet Auschwitz. He speaks for about 2 minutes and then actually passed out right after he began his sharing his experiences at the trial. No one knew who he was at the time because he had only written under a pen name, Katzetnik, that is one who came from the concentration camps. And so he was sort of unmasked in this moment as Yechiel Dinur, who was actually the writer of these books in Israel. Here you can see again a picture of Lebetkin on the left talking about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and her husband, Antek Zuckerman, another survivor from Warsaw, talking about the uprising at the trial. The way in which survivor testimony at the time functioned in the context of the trial was to educate the broader Israeli public and the broader world about sort of the broader experiences of Jews during the war, also to learn that Jews were people who could fight back. But one of the takeaways also was a deeper understanding of the broad nature of Jewish behavior during the war and the ways in which Jews had experienced the war, and a deeper appreciation for the survivor as a carrier of truth, a carrier of testimony, as a moral figure who could sort of come from there, meaning the world over there, the world of Europe, the world of the Holocaust, and they share their experiences here. And it's an important turning point to elevate sort of the survivor and survivor testimony for the broader Israeli public. I'll just share a brief clip from Lebetkin's testimonies at the trial, and then I'll come back to this example later.
So actually we were fighting with nothing.
שכשהתקרבו הגרמנים תחת העמדות שלנו ועברו בסך ואנחנו זרקנו את הפצצות והרימונים וראינו דם גרמני ניגר ברחובותיה של ורשה, אחרי זה שהרבה דם ודמעות יהודי ניגרו ברחובותיה של ורשה קודם לכן. שמחה גדולה, ולא היה חשוב מה יהיה מחר. שמחה גדולה הייתה בין הלוחמים היהודים. וראה זה פלא, הגיבורים הגדולים הגרמנים נסוגו בפחד עצום בפני הרימונים היהודיים והפצצות היהודיות מתוצרת בית. וראיתי
Okay, I'll stop it there. I'm going to come back to this, some of these testimonies about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising later, but you can think about sort of the significance of this moment within the broader history of the memory of the Holocaust as a significant turning point where a broader public begins to pay attention to the experiences of survivors, and actually a broad spectrum of survivors wanting to learn more about their experiences during the war. If we think about sort of important turning points in the development of audiovisual testimony, ironically enough, it is this NBC miniseries called Holocaust, which is on NBC in 1978, so on the 35th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, so April 19th, 1943 to April of 1978. And it's a completely sort of fictionalized account of the history of the Holocaust, but it does show the power of television and the power of recorded testimonies to reach a huge audience that never would have been reached before, and to use those recordings to educate. Again, in this case, right, we could see sort of actors, James Woods, Meryl Streep, Michael Moriarty, and others sort of conveying this history. And not everyone was pleased by this development, right? In fact, Elie Wiesel wrote a very strong critique in the New York Times in which he lamented the trivializing of the Holocaust. As he wrote at the time, the Holocaust must be remembered, but not as a show. And what he was quite worried about was that as soon as you began to fictionalize it, as soon as you began to dramatize it, right, and put it on television, this could not only sow doubts about the historicity of it, but it would sort of demean the nature of the experiences, and that there was something sacred about wartime experiences that became profane by putting it on television. So he was very upset about sort of what happens when you put it on TV. And yet what we start to see with the development of television as a technology, right? So think about the Eichmann trial, the turning point, how important it was in 1978 that a huge American television network teaches the history of the Holocaust through the huge audiences that it has at its disposal. And it was a worldwide phenomenon, right? Holocaust in 1978. And then we can also see in the 1980s this lengthy project that Claude Lanzmann, the documentary filmmaker, had undertaken to, again, teach the history of the Holocaust through using essentially survivor testimony. He interviews both perpetrators and survivors and bystanders, and shows the power of how you can use this medium to reach new audiences and to find newly discovered truths through it. Shoshana Feltman, who writes about Lanzmann's Shoah, explains sort of the power of the survivor, the power of the witness. As she writes, to bear witness is to take responsibility for truth, to speak implicitly from within the legal pledge and the juridical imperative of the witness's oath, to testify before a court of law, before the court of history and of the future, to testify likewise before an audience of readers or spectators, is more than simply to report a fact or an event or to relate what has been lived, recorded, and remembered. Memory is conjured here essentially in order to address another, to impress upon a listener, to appeal to a community. To testify is always metaphorically to take the witness stand or to take the position of the witness insofar as the narrative account of the witness is at once engaged in appeal and bound by an oath. To testify is thus not merely to narrate, but to commit oneself and to commit the narrative to others, to take responsibility in speech for history or for truth of an occurrence, for something which by definition goes beyond the personal and having general non-personal validity and consequences. And so I want us to think about sort of this, the witness and the era of the witness that begins in this period of time where the witness becomes the bearer of truth who can communicate to future generations, for those who were not there, what they had experienced it, right, to carry it forward, and the power of memory in this regard. And what we start to see exactly at the same time is this, right? So again, Holocaust is 1978. Lanzmann's Shoah, 1985. And you can see here a project that begins in 1979, actually in New Haven, Connecticut, that starts as the Holocaust Survivors Film Project to record the testimonies of survivors initially living in and around Greater New Haven, that demonstrated the power of recording audiovisual testimony as a way of sort of preserving these memories, but also creating an archive of survivor testimony that would be recorded. And today, this is the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies that has over 4,400 testimonies. Other developments that emerge around the same time is the creation of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which also embarks on its own testimony collection project. And of course, the Shoah Foundation, which after Schindler's List and after the opening of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Spielberg dedicates sort of the proceeds that come from Schindler's List to building, again, this vast archive of survivor testimony. And eventually, they've collected over 50,000 testimonies, both from survivors of the Holocaust and then a smaller number of testimonies from survivors of other genocides. And of course, I'll show you examples from other testimony collection projects, for example, at Yad Vashem. And I'll skip this for now, but perhaps in the Q&A, we can think about sort of what Spiegelman wrestles with, which is this question of how memory transfers from one generation to the next and how one carries this obligation of memory. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about sort of the history of these collection projects, I want us to think about how we use testimony as a teaching tool. And of course, one of the things for us to think about is this question of why we teach the Holocaust, right? What are the goals of Holocaust education? And how can these testimonies serve us in accomplishing these broader goals, right? And so I've just listed here some of the explanations that I've heard in the past: fostering empathy, confronting indifference, respecting the other, creating a culture of diversity, speaking out against discrimination, learning from the past, teaching for the future, right? Margaret Myers Feinstein, and I'm going to share this chapter for you from a book that I've edited called Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust. She's written about using survivor testimony in the classroom. And she writes about sort of the importance of what testimony can do in the classroom, that personal narratives can give students a better understanding of the effects of events and the variety of responses that were available to victims and how those responses varied over different times and places. She writes that the human dimension, the significance of individual decisions, the moral conundrums, and the life-saving or life-destroying impact of happenstance confronts students in ways that textbooks cannot, right? So, but at the same time, we can think about how we might teach them something and then use the testimony to reinforce what they've learned in the classroom. As she writes, many students will be able to empathize with survivors, many of whom were the students' age at the time of their persecution. And again, and I'm going to show you some examples of this, of thinking about sort of the age of the survivor at the time that they're undergoing these experiences and asking our students to be able to place themselves or try to understand the experiences of another, put themselves in their shoes, right? Which is ultimately what empathy is about. And she argues by engaging with the students, survivor interviews and testimonies promote learning. And it's been demonstrated that survivor testimony helps students better retain course information, leads them to become more interested in research. They can actually also become part of the testimony collection process. And I'll show you some examples of how to do that. And they seem to participate better in classroom discussions in response to testimonies, right? They're engaged and then they have something that they can respond to. And I would just say that one of the important things that survivor testimony can do is we always grapple with this when we're teaching the Holocaust. How do we convey for students the scope and the enormity of the Holocaust while preserving this perspective of the individual, right? That's one of the ultimate tensions. How do you convey the enormity? And so by focusing on the experiences of individual, this is a way to sort of drill down and say, okay, let's look at one example of one person and try to understand this and then magnify that by thinking about how many people. But I think it's incomprehensible when you focus on the 6 million, if you focus on one experience or a family's experiences or sort of a range of experiences that can be conveyed through both memoir and written, but also survivor testimony, it's a way that students, I think, can more readily engage the enormity of this history, right? So some guidelines for how we use testimony in the classroom. Of course, before the students engage with the specific testimony, there needs to be some historical context that is provided for the testimony that they're going to engage with. As teachers, we have to think about what are our goals, right? Why have we selected this testimony? What are the learning outcomes that we hope to achieve from sharing a specific testimony? What do we hope that the students will receive? So we can't just sort of say, okay, instead of teaching this, I'm just going to play it. Like we have to think about, okay, this is a text. I'm going to share this text with my students. What do I want them to learn from this text? And I'll say, so you can see here, understanding the differences between testimonies, right? So this is one of the reasons that I wanted to show you all the different types of testimonies that exist, right? So I'm going to show you, for example, Fortunoff Video Archive testimony. And those are testimonies that are recorded much closer to the end of the war, right? So 1979, 1980. In a lot of cases for the survivors who were interviewed in Fortunoff, this might be the first time that they're sharing a recorded testimony. Often the emotion is much closer to the surface than they might be for a testimony that's recorded, for example, by the Shoah Foundation, by the Spielberg, by the USC Shoah Foundation. The other thing to bear in mind, and this is something interesting to think about students, is the impact of the relationship between the interviewer who is in the room with the subject, the survivor is being interviewed, right? Oftentimes the interviewers from the Shoah Foundation, they had a questionnaire that they were following, and they would go sort of all the way down from beginning to the end. The Fortunoff Video Archive was much more invested in sort of a psychological interaction to let people sit with their emotions, and then it wasn't sort of as chronologically structured to get from the beginning to the end, and so that led to different outcomes. And so, you know, we can think about sort of what factors shape quote unquote successful testimonies, what shapes the power of it, why certain survivor testimonies are more powerful than others. Some people are just better storytellers than others, but all of that context also affects the way in which we receive the testimony. I'll come back to this memory issue later. So of course, as you know, there's lots of resources to provide context, the historical context, right? And I'm just showing you some examples of sort of, depending on if you're teaching about the 1930s in Germany or 1939 in Poland, right? To provide some of that basic historical context so that when we're watching the survivor testimony, we have that context before we engage with it. So let me skip ahead a little bit and just think about some, I'm going to try to cover 4 different examples of sort of aspects of the history of the Holocaust that we might try to use survivor testimonies to teach about. And in this case, I think all of the testimonies that I'm going to share with you are focused on teaching the victim perspective. But you could also think about using testimonies to teach different aspects, right? So to teach about rescuers and the motivations of rescuers, or to use a testimony to teach somebody who is rescued and think about sort of the impact of the rescuer on the survivor, or to teach about perpetrators and think about, and this is something that Landsman does effectively in Shoah, right? To interview perpetrators and then think about sort of the perpetrator motivation that emerges. And of course, and I'm not going to show this, but you can also think about the collections that are collected for teaching about bystanders. So for example, Father Patrick Desbois, who collects the Holocaust by bullets and does interviews with people who were witnesses to mass shootings that took place in Eastern Europe. It's actually a vast video archive. If you Google Holocaust by bullets, you can see all sorts of recorded testimonies with people who were not perpetrators, not victims, but saw what was happening and then share their experiences with a priest who comes 60 years later to talk to them about it. So let me skip ahead here. I'll just say that as we think about sort of the survivor testimonies and the way in which memory is shared, that right? What we're usually seeing when a survivor comes in and shares their memories with a class, or in this case, shares their memories on audiovisual testimony that is recorded, it's probably this bottom category of public memory. And what I mean by public memory is it's a type of memory that is openly shared, that sort of is deemed acceptable and understandable by a broader audience. And that might just be the top layer of the types of memories that are shared. But there's also all sorts of memories that, and often in many cases, are only shared amongst survivors themselves, only with people who would understand or people who were there. And if you weren't there, you wouldn't understand. And so I'm not going to share this memory with you. Or secret memory, choiceless choices that are never shared, right? That someone won't talk about. And then repressed memories, memories that have been repressed because of the traumatic nature of it. So it's interesting to think about with students this idea of how memory works and what is actually shared with us. All right, so let me just share some specific examples of testimonies to use in the classroom. So let's say that we're teaching a lesson on the Nazi rise to power, and we want to communicate to students the experience of what it felt like to be a child living in Nazi Germany after the Nazis come to power. And so, of course, the context that you want to share about teaching this is about the experience of dehumanization, the experience of living in a society that creates the Nazi race laws, of being a child growing up in a society where this is created and you're suddenly demonized and treated as a pariah and socially outcast. And you can teach this to your students. You could show them the text. You can get them to think about what it might feel like to live in a society where you are deemed other, and you may not even understand, and you're bewildered just because of who your grandparents are. This is how you've been defined and identified. Or, right, you can do that and then share a survivor talking about these experiences. So I'm going to share with you, this is from a project that I undertook here in Connecticut. So as you heard, I used to teach at the University of Connecticut, and we did a project actually in the museum that I directed at the University of Hartford called Hartford Remembers the Holocaust. Now it's on a website called CT Remembers. And so this is Margot Jeremias talking about what it was like to be a 7-year-old girl living in a small town not far from Heidelberg when the Nazis came to power. And I think she's also going to talk about going to school under these circumstances.
We lived outside of Heidelberg in a small village where there were very few Jewish people left. I was the only Jewish girl my age at the time. I went to public school, had a lot of friends, all non-Jews. And we had a very nice, comfortable life. My parents were friendly with non-Jews as well as with Jews. Our relatives came to visit quite often, and life was nice, good. In 1933, Hitler came to power. Immediately, the store was my father's store was closed, and nothing much else, as far as I was concerned, happened that day. The store was closed. I don't know how long that he was able to reopen it, but people were taught not to buy anymore. I still went to school, and I used to get sent home from school because they had what they called racial hour, where they taught the children to hate us. And all these nice friends I had, one after the other, would not speak to me anymore, would throw a stone at me. And I was put in the back of the schoolroom. I was not called up on. And things slowly became very difficult for me. I remember beating up one boy once. I was so angry, who was taunting me really a lot. And at that point, I got really angry and I beat him up, which was the wrong thing to do in a way. I could have been had consequences, but there weren't. It felt terrible. And I was lucky. Even as a child, I liked reading. So when I had no more friends, I was able to read at least. And I couldn't understand at first what's happening. I mean, I was only 7. I didn't know what was going on. So little by little, things got worse. My father had no more clients.
All right, I'm going to stop it there, but you can, I'm sure, think about sort of the ways in which this could be used within the classroom, right? So this idea of like just thinking about what might it have felt like to be a child in a small town undergoing sort of the Nazi rise to power, living in a town where sort of you have this school, and then there's a concept of racial hour that is incorporated as part of the Nazi indoctrination within the school. What it would feel like to be a Jewish child living in a town like this. And then sharing this testimony with students, I think it can open up a lot to think about how to teach an example like this. So another example, thinking about sort of how to teach about the Warsaw Ghetto and the experiences of being in the Warsaw Ghetto. You can obviously show the maps and show the experiences. You can teach about the history of the revolt. In this case, I'm going to share with you. So this is a testimony that is collected by the Fortunato Video Archive. This is Helen K. This is an edited testimony of Helen K. You can see the finding aid number there, HVT 8035. I think in this part, she's going to talk about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and actually becoming separated from her mother in the context of the revolt. And so what I mentioned before is paying attention to the differences between types of testimonies. You're going to see in this one, I think the emotion is much closer to the surface than we might see in certain other testimonies, especially of survivors who have been interviewed multiple times.
I want you to know my mother wasn't even 40 years old. Neither was my father. But my mother was... the Germans were coming, and we had to pull ourselves up on that rope, I told you, in the building. And she couldn't make it, so she went into the bunker below with the resistance. It wasn't exact. There were several bunkers. We didn't make big bunkers because we didn't want it. If the Germans will come in, we should have, not all the people should be caught. So we had like 5 different bunkers downstairs, and we were hiding upstairs, maybe 50, 60 people upstairs. My mother couldn't make the rope because the Germans were coming very rapidly, and she was hiding downstairs. And after they left, the Germans, I went to look for her, and she was gone. They came, you know, we were upstairs, I told you. They came with a fire truck. And with a ladder, they took us all down. So it was my brother, myself.
All right, so this testimony, you can see it's about a 30-minute, this is actually available on YouTube, is a 30-minute edited version of her much longer testimony, where she talks about being in Warsaw before the war, being in Warsaw in the ghetto, being in Warsaw during the revolt, and then she's actually deported to Majdanek. She talks about her different experiences. But one of the things that I wanted you to see in this example is also this technique that they use of a close-up, right, where you can see her face very very clearly, and it's an extreme zoom in on the face, and then sort of broadening out. And again, it's just interesting to think about sort of how these different techniques of audiovisual production also affect the ways that the testimonies are received. And I think our students, because they're all amateur filmmakers themselves, are probably in a place where they can pay attention to these things, and it's an interesting thing to think about. And in this case, as I said, the Fortunoff video testimonies, this is one from 1979, I want to say. So it's a very early example of this. Probably maybe one of the first times, or the first time, that she ever would have been recorded sharing this in an environment actually with 2 people interviewing her, one who's a psychologist, one who's a TV producer, right? So you can think about how that context also influences the nature of the testimony. lots of resources that exist for teaching about different examples of resistance, both types of armed resistance that are in the ghettos, also testimonies have been collected from partisans talking about their experiences fighting in the forest. Again, I mentioned before sort of the Lebetkin testimony from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. This is from a short collection actually created by Yad Vashem called Fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto. And actually, in this case, they've edited together a number of different testimonies of ghetto fighters from different political movements. So this is Mark Edelman, who you can see here, who's a Bundes. Tziva Lebetkin is an example of a testimony collected in the at the Eichmann trial. You'll also see here examples of survivors who were interviewed as part of the Shoah Foundation's testimony project.
שכשהתקרבו הגרמנים תחת העמדות שלנו, ועברו בסך, ואנחנו זרקנו את הפצצות
Trzeba było działać zaskoczenie.
This is Edelman
I takśmy
talking in
działali.
Polish.
Myśmy
And here's one
the
collected
first or second day. A couple of Germans during the
Shoah
first
Foundation.
or second day. Then they started 19th, and then don't remember exactly the date, but it was probably 25th, 26th of April 1943.
So Shimon ran after him to pick him off.
So I'm just showing you examples, right, of this is an 8-minute edited video from Yad Vashem, Fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto, where they've pulled together different types of resources. But if one is teaching sort of the history of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, you can both talk about sort of the revolt that began on April 19, 1943 as it went on. But this is a nice compilation of different fighters in the ghetto talking about different aspects of their experiences from different vantage points, right? And can also lead to an interesting exercise from students of how does one compile history of people who sort of live through this historical moment but are sharing their experiences based on their different vantage points through testimony. Another sort of example, right? So let's say you want to teach about the moment of liberation, right? So we've talked about sort of what is it like to be a Jew living under Nazi Germany? What is it like to live in the Warsaw Ghetto, or to live through to be a ghetto fighter, or to be part of the resistance, or to be a partisan? But oftentimes, and I think, one of the most interesting aspects that often is not covered in a lot of the testimonies of the period immediately after the war. But in this case, let's say you're teaching about sort of the moment of liberation, the end of the war. It can be quite remarkable then to share a good testimony that conveys the experience of what it was like to live through the moment of liberation, right? What was that experience like of seeing allies or seeing Russian soldiers come and liberate you? And so I'm going to show you an example. There are a number of, some of you are probably quite familiar with the testimony of Gerda Weissman-Klein, also which has been written about. She's shared in her All About My Life. But you can also see there's a number of different resources collected by a number of the different organizations that share her experiences. So here I'm going to share with you a testimony describing the moment of liberation.
My very clear view of freedom and liberation came that morning when I stood in this doorway of that abandoned factory. And I saw a car coming down the hill. And the reality of that came when I saw the white star on its hood and not the swastika. And there were two men in that car. One jumped out.
I saw some skeletal figures trying to get some water from a hand pump, but over on the other side, leaning next to against the wall, next to the entrance of the building, I saw a girl standing, and I decided to walk up to her.
I remember that aura of that awe, of the disbelief in daylight, to really see someone who fought for our freedom for my ideals. And he looked like God to me.
And I asked her in German and in English whether she spoke either language, and she answered me in German.
And I knew what I had to say. And I said to him, we are Jewish, you know. For a very long time, at least to me it seemed very long, but he didn't answer me. And then his own voice betrayed his emotion. He was wearing dark glasses, I couldn't see his eyes. He said, so am I.
I asked about her companions.
He said, may I see the other ladies? A form of address we hadn't heard for 6 years. I told him most of the girls were inside, they were too ill to walk. And he said to me, won't you come with me? I didn't know what he meant. So he held the door open for me and let me precede him. And that was the moment of restoration, of humanity, of humaneness, of dignity, of freedom.
We went inside.
I'm gonna stop it there in the interest of time, but not only is this sort of a remarkable compilation of the two of them who go on to get married and sort of describing this moment of liberation and then the encounter, but the way in which she also describes the rehumanization. So if you think about dehumanization, we don't often think about rehumanization, and the way in which her dignity is restored or begins to be restored through these very small gestures, very small kindnesses, which can restore her belief in humanity. You can think about what you can do with that with your students. Of course, there are also new technologies that have been developed for the use of survivor testimony in the classroom, and I'm happy to talk about this when we get to the Q&A. This is an example of, this is actually a picture from a gallery when it was available at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, the Dimensions in Testimony, in which one can interact with a recorded survivor testimony. This is also, I'll skip this now, but a trailer on the YouTube video that you can see of a description of sort of the way in which one can interact with this. I'm going to share something else that is a next generation of this sort of interactive testimonial that we can think about how this does and does not work within the classroom and the benefits and the challenges of this. So I just want to summarize sort of that, we have so many different digital archives that are available to the public and for educators that are user-friendly. You can think about the Shoah Foundation, the Fortune Video Archive, USHMM, other resources, smaller testimony collection projects like the one that I shared with you from Connecticut. And we have to think about sort of the differences about how the interviews are filmed, the ways in which it's structured, what is going to be the outcome of it. Of course, thinking about our goals and sort of what the testimonies can do in providing the audience with personal interaction and emotional power. And also thinking about that the ways in which exposing students to this personal and emotional interaction helps them retain information on a deeper level. Of course, the challenges are that we have to provide them with the context before they analyze it. Ideally, right, there are some testimonies that work better than others, especially the ones that students can more readily understand and comprehend. We also have to think about sort of the censorship or the self-censorship or the selection that takes place in terms of the types of testimonies that are shared or what survivors will and won't share, and how survivor testimonies might reflect on certain aspects of wartime experiences, but will not convey every single aspect of wartime experiences, right? It might provide a narrow sliver. And so we just have to have that awareness of, we don't want to just leave students with the idea of like silver linings, everybody survived, happy endings, but conveying it with sort of the broader complexity and the deep wrestling that we have to do with the terror of what people experienced during the war. Of course, there are so many resources that are available, and I'm going to just share a few examples of the resources that are available online. From the Holocaust Museum and the Shoah Foundation and Facing History and Ourselves and other organizations. Of course, as survivors pass away and it becomes more difficult for survivors to visit the classroom, we should be grateful for that there are so many resources available, but also think very consciously about how we want to use them and what works and doesn't work. And I'll just say that the survivors that we use in the classroom, right, we want to reflect upon the fact that they're one aspect of the experience, but they don't stand in for every single experience during the war. The Dimensions in Testimony project that the Shoah Foundation has undertaken. So let's say you have 25 survivors who are interactive and you can talk to, and they'll respond to you based on sort of the recordings of the testimonies. We want to make sure that students understand that there are many, many, millions of other experiences that are not reflected through just these 25 selected ones. So before I break for Q&A, let me just share my screen, a different screen, just to share some of these other resources that are out there, and then I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A. So just quickly, in terms of looking at the different tabs, you can see here a resource that is on the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's website for teaching with survivor testimony, that also provides a handout that provides testimony clips organized by topic. And then, if you see this worksheet that can be quite useful in the classroom, teaching with survivor testimony, analyzing testimonies within the classroom. This is the one that I showed you before of Gerda Weissman Klein. This is a worksheet from the USHMM site that specifically can be used in conjunction with the testimony that I shared with you. So this is a very, very handy sort of in-class worksheet that can be used. And there are multiple examples of this for different types of survivor testimonies, right? So if you go to this handout, you can see sort of different types of clips that the USHMM has compiled for resources that are available that convey different aspects of wartime experiences, right? So the idea of living under Nazi dictatorship in the 1930s, different aspects of experiences of persecution, experiences of the concentration camps, murder of people with disabilities, persecution and murder of the Jews, right? So I'm just sharing this with you in terms of topics to teach in a way that it's organized according to survivor testimonies, based on different topics that can be used for teaching, right? So again, I just scratched the surface of sort of different resources that are available. And again, being specific about what do you want to teach, what are your goals, and then how will this testimony assist you in that. Of course, many of you might be familiar with the eyewitness resource that is available through the Shoah Foundation. Again, I'm just showing you like examples of, this is a lesson that is designed around Kristallnacht, and again, survivor testimonies that have been compiled by the Shoah Foundation for teaching about Kristallnacht. This is the site that I showed you before called Connecticut Remembers the Holocaust. You can see here the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies. So the edited program that I showed you before, this is the Helen K testimony, and they've compiled. So again, there's thousands of testimonies that they have. This resource just shares a few of their different sort of testimonies that have been edited down that can be used. Let me just say something if I didn't say it before. You have to be sure to watch these beforehand, before you assign it to your students, to make sure that they are ready for all the content that will be included in it. And I know we're talking about different age levels and different levels of background and understanding. As a teacher, you have to make sure that you've watched it and make sure that your students are ready for the material that is going to be shared. And if not, right, then pick something else that can work for them. This is another recorded testimony of Gerda Weissman Klein. I'll just show you two other things. Facing History and Ourselves also has a resource collection for teaching with testimony, and then different examples of sort of ways to use testimonies in the classroom. The Yad Vashem, disregard the typo here, also has a lesson plan for using testimony in the classroom, and gets us to think consciously about how we use testimony, what testimony means, what our goals are in using testimony. So this is from Yad Vashem. And then the last thing I want to share is something that is a resource that you heard referenced by Rachel in the introduction at the Museum of Jewish Heritage on survivor stories. And in the Q&A, we can spend more time talking about this. But this is very interactive as a resource that is not unlike sort of what the Dimensions and Testimony project of the Shoah Foundation, where you can have your students interact with recorded testimonies by survivors, and then using AI, the computer will essentially play back for you the appropriate response. So let me just feed it a question. Can you tell me about your life before the war?
It was a normal childhood like every other kid. I went to public school, and I was the older of two siblings. And we lived like any other family of four. There was a mama, there was a papa, there was Ruth, and there was Walter. Walter was 4 years younger than I.
Right, and so then if you click through, you can go to the group of survivors and hear them each answer this question.
Before the war, it was ideal in many ways. It was terrible in other ways.
Right, so
It was ideal because
I'll stop it there in the interest of time, but you can see and you can think about sort of how this can work with students in terms of what are they curious about? What do they want to know about? They can ask the group of survivors different questions. It becomes very interactive in this regard. So again, if we're thinking about using testimony to interact with a survivor, which can be the most impactful nature of a student's learning about it, and how do we provide them with that experience in a time where it's much more difficult to bring survivors into the classroom, this is a way to try to replicate that experience. I'm going to stop myself there because I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions that might have come in.
Thank you so much, Professor Patt. That was a very wonderful presentation. And thank you so much also for showcasing the survivor stories. We at the museum are very proud of it and very happy that it launched this January, actually. And we're really excited to see how going forward we'll be able to help teachers use it in the classroom. Like you showed, it's available online. It's also available physically at the museum as well. And now we have a few questions that were in the chat. I'm just going to go in chronological order so I make sure that I get to everybody. The first one that I have here is asking if you have a preference for one form of recorded testimony that you prefer using in the classroom, whether that's written, video, or audio.
So I appreciate the question. I mean, I think one of the interesting things that we can do is sort of layer them on top of each other, which can also be interesting to get students to reflect on how they learn best, or how sort of so for example, right, you can take a written testimony. Let's say you take a memoir by someone like Gerda Weissman Klein, and then you have the students read it and then watch the recorded testimony, right? That could be an interesting exercise if one has the time. Of course, you may not always have the time to do that, and I'm quite conscious of it. And one of the things that I will say is that I, in this presentation, shared with you, again, in the interest of time, like 30-second clips, 2-minute clips, maybe 4-minute clips. And I think that can actually work quite effectively when it's part of a larger lesson, a larger presentation, sort of interspersed, right? So you could have the students read a survivor's memoir, or you could have them read a testimony that's collected during the war. You could then have them watch at the same time or in the same lesson a post-war recorded testimony, and again, sort of have the students reflect on the impact of reading versus watching. It doesn't necessarily need to be the same person, but for them to think about sort of their emotional reaction to it when they're reading it versus when they're watching it, and what the impact of that might be. The other thing I'll say in terms of types of of video testimonies. So what I find interesting and why I wanted to share like the different types of them is, and here I'm just thinking about sort of comparing, let's say, Fortunoff Video Archive, the USHMM, and the Shoah Foundation as an example. So each of them, like each project actually, and I see there's a question about children of survivors that I want to talk about in a second. Each of them actually sort of had different contexts within which they were interviewing survivors. And so I think it's important also to think about the context within which the survivor is interviewed and how that affects the nature of the testimony that's collected. So like Fortuna Video Archive, I think they were much more interested in sort of getting into the deeper layers of emotions of experiences that survivors had. And so that's why I think sometimes it can be sort of more emotional. You see more expression of emotion in them versus the Shoah Foundation, where, and I'm not putting a value judgment on one versus the other, but the Shoah Foundation was really focused on like, let us collect as many testimonies as we can so that we have documentation of these experiences. And it was really important to say like, to get from before the war to during the war and make sure you tell me about all your different experiences. And again, like, so if we're thinking about like if a student is watching a 4-minute clip, if this is part of a longer 4-hour testimony, they'd be like, okay, I'm showing you a 4-minute clip that's part of a longer 4-hour testimony, but just be aware of sort of that context.
Okay, thank you for that. We had another question that was asking about if you have any recommendations for methods for emotionally preparing students to hear testimony, although I feel like this could also be relevant just for having students learn about Holocaust in general.
Yeah. And this is again where I think it totally depends on the age, the class. So each class is different, right? In terms of like the student's readiness and their experience, the context within which you're teaching it. Do you have a day? Do you have a week? Do you have a month? Do you have a semester? And yes, but I think it is important to sort of have an induction, like I said, induction, a beginning point where they can sort of you know, you don't want to throw the very heavy emotional, like sharing of experiences right at them right at the beginning, I think, right? So I think maybe it's better to prepare them with some of the historical context, for example, just to get the introduction to the material. And then think about like, what do I want them to take? This is again, what do I want them to take away from it, right? So I do think that it's incumbent upon, and I know teachers, we have like a limited amounts of time. There's so many things you have to teach, but just to be careful that you're not sharing something with your students that is too heavy or too emotionally laden for them that they may not be prepared for, if it's not aligned with your educational goals, right? So again, right, like if you're teaching about the experience of partisans fighting in the forests, to introduce the concept by teaching them about the historical context and then say, okay, we're going to watch the survivor testimony of somebody who was with the Bielski partisans, for example. And right, provide them some layer of preparation before you get into that material.
Our next question is asking about if there are testimonies available to the public that are in languages that are not English, such as French or Italian.
Yes, yes. So excellent question. And the short answer is yes. And so if you have students who, right, like the English is not their first language, or you want them to, so there have been a number of projects that have, I would say they're more like local collection projects. So for example, just to give you a couple of examples, in Paris, there are collection projects that exist through the historical commissions in Paris or through museums in Paris. In Montreal, there's actually collection projects that exist. There are testimonies that have been collected in Mexico City, testimonies that are collected in Buenos Aires. If you go to the Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive, which I don't know if I left that page open, but and I won't, okay, I can't open it right now, but if you go to the Visual History Archive, so it's VHA, and then the Shoah Foundation's archive, as an educator, it's fairly simple. You just sort of enter your email address, you register, and then you can access this huge trove of testimonies that have been collected by the Shoah Foundation, and you can search by language. And so when you search by language, you can actually find, if you have students that you can find there, because what they've done is also they've brought over other collection projects that have been done by other repositories. So you can search in Spanish, you can search in French, you can search in Polish, you can search in Hebrew, if you have students who want to sort of watch in those original languages. Anyway, yeah, so it's actually quite searchable, and you can find interesting things that way.
Fantastic. On our next question, I will take for 2 seconds, and I will have a couple comments about as well. It's asking, is there a process for questioning children of survivors or second generation or third generation, as well as it is also asking about if most of these survivors that are interviewed are from Germany or other countries.
So did you want to start with that
Yeah,
one?
I just wanted to briefly mention that, like I mentioned in my introduction, the museum has our program called Heritage Testimonies, which does interview and have presentations by second and third generation survivors telling the stories of their families' survival of the Holocaust. And that is available if you get in contact with the museum. So feel free to reach out to myself or anyone else in the education department, and we can set you up with that as well. But then I wanted to get your comments on that as well.
Yeah. So I appreciate the question, because this is something that I didn't talk about it today, but from a research standpoint, I've been very interested in conducting interviews with children of survivors. And so actually I did a project when I was still at the University of Hartford called the In Our Own Words Interview Project, which was solely focused on children of survivors. And actually have a chapter that's coming out in a book that I can share a PDF with you, Rachel, if people are interested, or people could write to me also, my email address, which I'll put in the chat, and I'm happy to share that chapter, where I outline sort of the format that we used to design this interview project with the children of survivors, to think about, not necessarily like we didn't want them to have to retell their own parents' experiences, but an interview project where they reflect on what it's like to grow up as a child of a survivor. Did they have one parent? Did they have two parents who were survivors? Did their parent talk about it? Did their parent not talk about it? Were there sort of unique family traditions that developed? Were there behaviors that they would ascribe to it? Comparing the way in which they reflect on the experience compared to siblings. It's very often one child who sort of takes on that role. So anyway, I happen to be very interested in this, and I'm happy to share more material on that, because I think there's actually a lot more to be done. And then what I will say is also someone who's worked with some of the heritage testimonies participants at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. I think it's the format is extremely effective, again, to have, so as Rachel started off with, right, what do you do when you can't bring survivors into the classroom anymore? And so we've talked about audiovisual testimony, but one of the things that I find quite effective about heritage testimonies is you can have the child of a survivor essentially go into a classroom, or create like a PowerPoint presentation where they both teach the class about their parent or grandparents' experiences, but then also share the clips that I shared with you today, like, different excerpts of their parent or grandparents' recorded testimony, and then provide the context that is necessary. Like, here, my mother or father, or here, my grandmother or grandfather is going to tell you about X, Y, and Z, and pay attention to this. It's a very effective way. And it's also, I think, quite meaningful for the class to think about, okay, I'm not meeting the survivor, but their child thinks it's important to tell their story. Their grandchild thinks it's important to tell their story. And often the grandchild will be much closer to the age of the students in the class. So that can also be quite powerful, right? In a way that they can relate to it. Rachel, I just want to share. So I just pulled this up. So this is what I was referencing when you go to the Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive. So you can see here I've already created my own login, but again, it's quite simple to create your own login. And then you can search by languages, for example, right? So you can do sort of a search on the basis of experiences of 57,000 testimonies that document the history of the Holocaust. And the question was about French. So again, right, like if I apply this, I get, I think 1,940 testimonies in French about the Holocaust. And then, of course, you can then drill down even more and see sort of different aspects of wartime experiences, or search on the basis of keywords for wartime experiences, right? So it is quite user friendly, and you can, and what I will say also is, like, as a teaching tool, if you want to have students do their own research, like, hey, I want you to go write a paper about, and then you can reflect about, like, people who were saved hiding in monasteries, or people who survived the war fighting with the partisans, or people who were in towns in Germany when the Nazis came to power, right? Like, students can do their own research on this and create their own accounts to do their own research, and then sort of do their own projects. And I think it is very, very usable in that regard, and well designed to teach students also how to do research.
Thank you for those thoughts. And we are approaching the end of our time, but we have a few more questions as well. There's also a question about that kind of relates to the overall theme of this series as well. Acknowledging that we're focusing on survivor testimonies, but that you made a comment earlier about Elie Wiesel's editorial in the New York Times. The question is, do you know of any film or series that Elie Wiesel or other survivors approve of, or any that other survivors have approved of in general?
Yeah, so what I will say, just first of all, like, generally thinking about change over time, I mean, what's interesting, so that sort of pretty harsh critique of Holocaust in 1978, and that when the miniseries comes out, right, like, I think there's a serious discomfort about using this popular medium, television, that is a form of entertainment, to teach the history of the Holocaust. And also, like, just things like, this was a time where on television there were commercial breaks. So is it appropriate to have a show about the Holocaust that has commercial breaks? And for those of us who sort of remember television from when you just had the major broadcast networks, it was also a big deal when you would have shows where, like, uninterrupted without commercial break. That was a big deal. So yeah, but then I think for Wiesel, what's interesting is, and I don't know, I'm not, or at least off the top of my head, I can't think of, but I think his attitude to this also must have changed over time, just about sort of like how you can use television. I'm just thinking about sort of later in his life when Night became part of the Oprah Book Club, and Elie Wiesel goes on Oprah and then takes Oprah on a visit to the camps, right? Like, sort of that there are ways in which one can use a popular medium to reach a much, much broader public. But then again, right, like, it matters. And this is interesting in the context of this whole series, as you talked about, Rachel, that it actually matters. Like, the first lesson that we did about sort of using film, and we had this conversation about, like, feature films, fictionalizing the Holocaust, but being responsible to do it against a backdrop of historical fact, versus, like, the dangers of, like, when you slip into, and I use the example of the boy in the striped pajamas, where you slip into sort of creating a fable or something that doesn't rely on historical fact, and the dangers of students sort of getting confused about what actually happened, like Inglourious Bastards is another example. And so I would just say that, like, as a rule of thumb, I would, and again, as a historian, I lean on the side of like something that is based in solid historical research. It doesn't mean that you can't, because everything that is a representation on film, it's still ultimately entertainment. It doesn't mean that you can't sort of use that medium of popular entertainment, but at the same time, use it as a tool to educate people. And the trade-off is, of course, you're going to reach a much, much broader audience than you would with a written text. So yeah, but when done responsibly, I think it can be valuable.
I'm going to close it out with one final question, which is asking about if you think that a testimony alone can be substantial as a standalone lesson in the classroom, or do you recommend pairing it with perhaps a book like Night or another source when teaching the Holocaust?
Yeah, so again, it, depends on how much time one has. And what I will say is, like, I always feel like it's more important to teach it and make sure that your students are introduced to it, even if you don't have the time or you can't do it comprehensively. Like, I don't want teachers to shy away from the topic, because they can't do everything, they can't teach it all, they can't sort of do it. Like, what I would suggest though is to, even if you just introduce them to a topic through a focused, so for example, let's just take Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz, which I think is, one of the best texts to use to introduce students to what it was like to be in Auschwitz. And that by itself, right, would be enough. Or even if one only had the time to do one chapter from it, right? Like, that's also fine. If you can layer it, right, and you can do sort of, okay, here's an account written by an Italian Jew who's in the camp from this period of time to this period of time, and then we're going to watch that, we're going to read that, and then we're going to watch another survivor's testimony, and you could compare the two texts, right? Or you could do like three different representations, right? Like, the students could read Primo Levi, they could watch a survivor testimony, and then they could watch a film, if they're up for it, or if they're of a level that also is a representation. Some of the films that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, like Son of Saul, for example, or other or The Gray Zone, or other representations of Auschwitz that are out there. And that could be, again, because one of the things ultimately, like, what are our outcomes? We want learning outcomes. We want them to learn the history that is being represented here. We want them to have empathy for the experiences of others, but it can also be very effective for them to develop critical thinking skills, like to compare different type of texts. And so again, read Primo Levi, watch a feature film, watch a survivor testimony, read poetry, like, think about all these different types of texts that you're exposing your students to, and get them to think critically about, like, what is their reaction to each of it, what is effective, what does one do that the other doesn't do. Like, there's a lot that you can do with that.
Great. That is all the questions that we had today. Thank you so much, Professor Patt, for your time. And to everyone tuning in, thank you so much for joining us today. After the program, we will send out an evaluation form and a CTLE application to those who have participated. Our program today is the latest installment of the Fania Gottsfeld Heller and Joseph Heller Professional Development Series, and is made possible through the generous sponsorship of Dr. Jacqueline Heller in memory of her parents, Fania Gottsfeld Heller and Joseph Heller. For more information and to register for any of the upcoming events, including our events on May 14th and June 6th, please check your email for our email blast featuring our professional development programs, or go to our website, mjhnyc.org, and click events. We look forward to learning with you soon in the future. Again, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.